The United States National Park Service each year receives thousands of complaints from people that visit the parks. I thought I'd share with you just a few. Here's the first that comes from the Arches National Park, which is known for natural rock formations. Several of these natural rock formations are arches. And I quote, "I thought there would be more arches. Calling it Arches National Park is misleading. Need to install more arches." This one comes from Biscayne National Park in Florida, which, let me kind of give you some context. Biscayne National Park is 95% water. It's a swamp. And I quote, this person wrote, "We were bitten by mosquitoes constantly. Restrooms, we found, were few and far between. But in just 5 minutes, we were bitten so many times by mosquitoes. Can you do something about that?" The park is some 60,000 square miles. There is not enough DEET in the world to destroy all those mosquitoes. Here's the third complaint from Congaree National Park in South Carolina. On our 4-mile hike, there were spiders everywhere. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. It's a national outdoor park. Spiders should have been dealt with, though. And this comes from the Grand Canyon National Park. This person writes, and I quote, "What a disappointment. It's just a giant ditch." Somebody legitimately wrote that. Yeah, let's fill it in. Let's fill it in with dirt. And this comes from the Theodore Roosevelt National Park. The person said, "I gave this park a 1 star. And the reason, the wild horses, well, they look just like regular horses." The horses should have been more wild in appearance, right? Paint their hair blue. That'd make them more wild. And finally, from Big Bend National Park in Texas, it says, "We traveled for miles and we never saw a bear or a mountain lion." And I continue the quote. It said, "You would think the park rangers would train the animals to hang out some 100 yards or so from the trails." There's more. But apparently the government is too incompetent to even pull off some basic services, end of quote. Training bears and mountain lions is a basic service by this person's standards. Well, you know what? When people's experience does not meet their expectation, they're disappointed. You know, somebody once said the gap between expectation and reality is a gap called disappointment. And obviously these tourists submitting their complaints obviously expected a more pampered experience when they chose to spend some vacation time in a national outdoor preservation. You know, it would have been fun had it not been for all those spiders and mosquitoes and those darn untrained bears, right? And why should we be surprised? Most experiences don't match our expectations. And that's certainly true when it comes to our perception of how life should unfold for a Christ follower. For Christians, the untrained bears come in the form of human suffering. Somehow the anticipation of going through human suffering never made it to our 21st century understanding of Christianity. In fact, I believe that Christ followers today expect the teaching they receive from the Bible to be a repellent to suffering, rather than an understanding of how to live in the midst of suffering. Let me remind you what Jesus taught his followers. He said, suffering ought to be expected. Jesus warned us in John chapter 16, verse 33. He says, "In me you're going to have peace, but in the world you're going to have trouble." But he says, "Take courage, for I have overcome the world." In other words, I win in the end. So please understand that suffering was not a part of God's original creation. He knew it would come, but it wasn't a part of his original creation. But when sin entered the world at the fall, the ripple effect of sin changed everything. Our sin, once sin became a part of our nature, well, then we hurt ourselves, we hurt others, and we hurt the ones we love. We hurt others, we hurt ourselves, and we hurt each other. The bears are untrained. And when we became a Jesus follower, that didn't protect us from the natural temporal consequences of sin. Sin causes suffering, and all of us are victimized by sin. But here's the amazing thing about God. As horrible as our suffering is, the amazing thing about God is he can use our suffering for good. In other words, Satan didn't win when we became infected with sin. Therefore, Satan doesn't win when we suffer. God has the last word in human suffering. Now, I want to give you 4 primary reasons that God allows his followers to suffer. And first of all, let me lay down some groundwork. Every person alive, or whoever has lived, has suffered or will suffer. And the reason is because we live in a broken world. Jesus told us it rains on the just and the unjust alike in his Sermon on the Mount. But when someone becomes a Christ follower, please pay attention. God has a special use for suffering in the life of a believer. And if we live long enough, all of us who love Jesus will experience what I'm about to reveal. Now, I have adapted these 4 categories from a website called Got Questions. It's a website designated to give us biblical answers to life's most common questions. So I've woven some of my own thoughts in these, but they give us kind of a framework. And here's the first reason that God allows human suffering. The first is suffering is used sometimes to discipline us. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 7 says, endure hardship as discipline. And the example we have, just like a loving parent disciplines a child so they don't do something that can hurt them, the parent spanks the hands so they don't touch the hot stove. In the same way, our loving Heavenly Father is willing to discipline us for the purpose of godliness. God's designated hardship can literally steer us to stay away from a sin that can do damage to ourselves or to someone else. Here's the second reason that God allows suffering. Suffering enables Christians to identify with other people who are currently suffering. I mean, think about it. Jesus, the ultimate one who knows what it's like to feel pain. Therefore, when we feel pain, Jesus feels compassion for us when we experience pain because he himself has felt pain. Micro example of this, when someone loses a job, well then you know what, we can relate to someone else who loses a job. The principle is sufferers relate to those who suffer. The third reason that God allows human suffering is suffering helps us draw closer to the Lord. You've heard me say on different occasions, I wish that God would use donuts to draw us closer to God, but God uses pain. And the reason he uses pain, it's that megaphone that when we are in pain, whether it's physical or emotional, God is the source that we turn to on bended knee because there is no place else for us to turn. He's the only one that can make sense of it. He's the only one that ultimately where we'll find comfort. And the fourth reason I believe that God uses human suffering is suffering reminds us that the world is not our home. See, when we experience persecution for our beliefs, when we experience physical pain from sickness, maybe emotional pain, we are reminded that our future home, where we know we will have no more pain, is there waiting for us. See, when truth is when push comes to shove, when we are living pain-free in the lap of luxury, well, it's very easy to drift to becoming too infatuated with the here and now of our worldly comforts. And then our worldly comforts become our idol rather than God being our refuge. There are those in the world today that teach that if we have enough faith, we can eliminate suffering in our life. Well, that's a false hope. And that causes us to worship our comfort and convenience rather than God. And bottom line, God chooses to use a believer's suffering to advance the gospel. Because I believe one of the greatest miracles in the Bible is when a believer, through pain and suffering, still praises God. Can God heal? Absolutely. And that's a miracle. But I believe what's a far greater miracle is when somebody in the midst of their pain and suffering still chooses to say, as for me and my household, we will worship the Lord. There's a passage in Hebrews chapter 11 that talks about human suffering. I want to read just a few of these verses to you because human suffering is commonplace. And I'm reading from Hebrews in the New American Standard, starting in chapter 11, verse 36. And it says, and others experienced mockings and scourgings, yes, also chains and imprisonment. It's talking about believers in the first century. Verse 37, they were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were tempted, they were put to death with the sword. They went about in sheepskins and in goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. Then it says, men and women of whom the world is not worthy, wandering in deserts and mountains and caves and holes in the ground. And you're thinking, well, this isn't what I signed up for in Christianity. Sawn in two, left for dead, abandoned, wandering in deserts. See, that preaching won't get you far in 21st century Christianity. See, believers in the New Testament were convinced that the pain they were enduring was minuscule compared to the reward they will experience in heaven. That's why the Apostle Paul would write to the church in Corinth in his second letter to the Corinthian church in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17. This is what he says. He says, for momentary light affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Now, did we get that right? He's saying your human suffering is momentary and light compared to the eternal weight of glory. By comparison, there's nothing even to compare. And that statement from someone just seems so callous. But yet I don't believe it's lighthearted. I believe that that's hopeful. All human suffering is light compared to what we have in heaven. That's not flippant. I believe that's hopeful. You know, the fact that God doesn't waste your pain. Every believer who goes through pain, would you rather have God doesn't waste your pain, or would you rather just go, oh, wow, it stinks to be you? See, that's the world's message. Oh, wow, you're going through suffering? I don't know what to do with that. Nobody has an idea about that, but yet God's the only one who has something to say and can give sense to your human suffering. And that is that he has a plan, and it fits in line with his plan. See, we cannot understand suffering apart from what God's eternal plan is. I want to show you where we've been in our study of Acts. I've got a map. Paul is currently in Lystra. I want to show you this map. We saw that you remember there's all sorts of Antiochs in this Middle Eastern area. They were all named after a guy's dad. He liked his dad, and so he just named all these cities Antioch. But you've got Antioch over here on the east side of your map. That's where Paul and Barnabas started their journey. They came down to Cyprus. They went over here to Perga. Then they went up to Antioch. Then they went down to Iconium and Lystra and Derbe, kind of these sister cities down there. In every place they went to, in Antioch, up north, kind of northwest corridor of your map there. Well, once they got through preaching the gospel, they were run out of town. Then they go to Iconium. They were run out of town. And now we find our story in chapter 14, verse 19, that this is where they are. They have spoken God's truth in love. Last week we saw that apart from truth, people will misunderstand why Jesus came and what Jesus accomplished when he died on the cross. So Paul proclaimed that Jesus died on the cross to pay the penalty for man's sin. And no one comes to the Father apart from that act performed by Jesus on the cross. In other words, Jesus is the only way to God. Now we pick it up in verse 19. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having won over the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city. They're in Lystra, supposing him to be dead. So Paul first preached to Antioch, Pisidia. After 2 weeks, they chased him out of town. Then he came to Iconium, preached there. They did the same thing. The Jewish leaders incited a crowd, and they ran Paul out of Iconium. Now Paul is in Lystra. And the angry Jewish leaders from Antioch, Pisidia, from Iconium, travel 100 miles down. They join forces together and follow Paul to Lystra, where they incite the crowds in Lystra. And the crowds in Lystra, under the direction of the Antioch and Iconium Jewish leaders, they stone Paul. They try to kill him. And an appropriate question to ask is, what got them so riled up that they would travel 100 miles to kill Paul? Last week we built the argument that the gospel itself will offend people. You don't have to be an antagonist necessarily to get people riled. All you have to do is associate yourselves with Jesus, because the gospel in and of itself will offend people. Because the gospel proclaims we've got a sin capacity. And Jesus came to pay the penalty for our sin. And people can become very cranky when they are told that they have a sin nature that Jesus came to destroy. And I want you to consider something. Satan gets unsuspecting people to administer his mission to steal, kill, and destroy. In other words, Satan gets unsuspecting people to do his dirty work. In this situation in Lystra, based upon appearances, it seems as though they were successful in killing Paul. Paul seems dead. He was, in fact, close to death. So the angry mob drags him out of Lystra, dumps his body outside the city limits. Remember, this is the same crowd a few days earlier wanted to worship Paul as a god. Remember, they likened him to Zeus. And here we see, once someone allows the disease of being offended to get into them, they can become enraged quickly. Proverbs chapter 18, verse 19 confirms with us, once someone allows themselves to be offended, it is very hard to reason with them. Being offended, you become a lit match. And let me remind you, in our culture, people all the time, they use this card. Oh, you offended me. Let me be very clear. No, whenever you're offended, it's because you chose to be offended. Don't give somebody else power over how you behave. To say, oh, you offended me, well, that's taking a passive role. No, you chose to be offended. Throughout Paul's ministry, Paul would experience many attempts on his life. In fact, in his second letter to the church at Corinth, in chapter 11, verses 23 through 27, Paul remembers, get this, he says, 5 times they whipped me 39 times with the cat o' nine tails. He says, 3 times they beat me with rods. He says, 1 time I was stoned. What he's referring to is this time in Lystra that he was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. He even said this. He said, I lost track of the number of times I have been beaten up. And remember, Paul considered all of his suffering as momentary and light compared to what he's going to receive in heaven. Now, please consider this. If you're going to go through all of this, all of these beatings with a whip, all of these times where you're beaten with rods, all the times you can't even remember how many times you were beaten up, when you were stoned and left for dead, if you're going to go through all that, and by the way, let me catch you up. When he writes to the church in Galatia, he says that, he says, my body bears the scars on account of Jesus. Well, I guess so. I mean, people would go, wow, what happened to him after going through all of this? So Paul had, my body was scarred on account of this. So he's saying, if you're going to go through all of that, you had better be convinced the benefit outweighs the pain. You had better be convinced the mission of getting the gospel message out is of more value than my comfort. And see, that's what we miss in 21st century Christianity. Because quite frankly, we have bought into this, well, God is supposed to grease the wheels and make life easy for me. And God's going, I never told you guys that. That's what the culture said. That's not what I said. See, if we are convinced that Jesus' mission is more important than our comfort, then what we will do is we will position our life to avoid suffering at all costs. In Hebrews chapter 11, there is a line in there that haunts me. Because basically it's talking about these, it starts off, it says, and women, and then believers, who were being persecuted, who were suffering for their faith. They chose, get this, they chose to continue to suffer than to be freed from their suffering. Are you following me? There were believers in the New Testament when offered, well, if you stop talking about Jesus, we'll let you go. They said, no, we'll keep suffering rather than being let free. Wow. Because they were convinced that it was going to be well worth it. See, that's humbling. Paul's attitude, no, suffering, definitely worth it. Now we pick it up in chapter 14, verses 20 and 21. It says, but while the disciples stood around him, remember they'd thrown his body outside the city limits, they left him for dead. But while the disciples stood around him, they rushed to, oh no, Paul's dead, they rushed around him. Paul gets up. He doesn't go to the hospital. He doesn't flee the city. He doesn't camp out. He doesn't nurture his wounds. He goes back into Lystra. And then the next day, he goes with Barnabas into that sister city, Derbe. And what did he do there? Well, in verse 21, and then they preached the gospel to the city and had made many disciples, and they returned to Lystra and Iconium and to Antioch. Now, somehow Paul survives this. And as his fellow believers gather around him, when he gets up, he goes back into the city, and you go, what? Why? No one would have thought just kind of evading the city and going home. But I think Paul was convinced, my time's not up yet. And his willingness to return to Lystra had to make an impact that the message of suffering for Christ is going to be worth it. And let me give you an example of how it was worth it. If we were to read ahead, and next week we'll look at chapter 16, but let me peek into the covers of chapter 16. Because when you read ahead, you know that there was this woman who was a follower of Christ, and this woman had a son. And this son's name was Timothy. And Timothy came from this place called Lystra. And the impact on Timothy must have been marked by the suffering of Paul, because this young Timothy decides what Paul is doing, that's what I want to do when I grow up. I want to be a suffering servant. And so Timothy, this is where Timothy said, I'm going to follow him. Huh? Now, in the context of the passage, his mom, who was a believer, was okay with it. Can you imagine if Timothy's mom, I don't know her name, let's just call her Timothy's mom. You remember Timothy's mom? She goes to the water hole and she's getting water, and people go, well, hey, I haven't seen your son recently. What is he doing? Well, Timothy, that crazy lug, he is following Paul into ministry. He's going to be a suffering servant. Isn't that great? Can you imagine the women at the watering hole? Can you imagine? You want to do everything you can to keep your child safe and comfortable, right? When your child comes to you and says, you know what, I want to raise support and I want to be a missionary and I'm going to go to Nepal. I'm going to go to probably the biggest third world area I can think of. And I'm going to suffer for Christ, Mom and Dad. You know what you do as a parent? Let me tell you what most parents do. They try to talk them out of it. They say, oh, that's noble. That's really sweet, honey. But you know what? That's just not wise. Timothy's mom was okay with it. And I just picture Timothy's mom around the watering hole going, yeah, he's going with Paul. You remember the one that the people in Lystra stoned? And I think maybe, Myrtle, you threw a rock too, didn't you? You know, and that's when the women of the city kind of look at her like, you know, that awkward smile that people have on. Yeah, I'm going to church this morning. Really? Oh, and their smile is more painful than church. See, there's something that's going on here. Suffering launches someone else into ministry. You realize that? Mark it well. Anytime you see suffering in the New Testament, you know what it does? Is it launches people into ministry. Because God does not waste your pain. Years ago, I was thinking about this. Dennis and Barbara Rainey, some 50 years ago, started Family Life, started reaching out to marriages, teaching biblical truths to marriages. And Dennis tells the story in one of his books where he says we were living in a one-room apartment that didn't have heat, and it was over a garage. And he said we knelt on the cold floor by our bed, and we prayed that somehow God would raise up a group of people, some young couples who would follow them in ministry and in ministering to marriages across the country. And when I read that when I was in my 50s, and I said, Julie, because Julie and I have been working with Family Life, Dennis and Barbara have been mentors for 30 years. And I thought, Julie, we are the fruit of Dennis and Barbara's prayers. And just like Timothy was a product of Paul's suffering, couples like Julie and I were a product of Dennis and Barbara's suffering, and probably you're a product of somebody else's sacrifice. You know what we see in Paul? There is this steadfast determination that says, I am not going to stop speaking about what I know to be true. And I think when it's all said and done, persistence was one of Paul's greatest attributes. The enemies of the cross had to be thinking, we can't get rid of this guy. Every time we beat him, he just keeps coming back. He's like a bad habit. He won't go away. And now Paul, it says, retraces his steps. Remember, he's gone from Iconium to, now he's gone to Lystra. And now he's going to retrace his steps. The reason he came the way he came was to preach the gospel to Antioch, Pisidia, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. Now I want you to see why he returns, even though the areas where he was returning are full of people who want him dead. Look at verse 22 and 23. So it says, Paul and Barnabas, they go the opposite direction they came, or they retrace their steps the way they came, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying, through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. He's not saying this is going to be easy. You're going to follow Jesus, you're going to go through tribulations. Verse 23, and when they appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. Now, as important as it was for Paul to share the gospel in these cities originally, Paul's continued influence depended on strengthening those believers that would remain in those cities. How did he instill strength? By encouraging them that their suffering for the sake of Jesus would be worth it. And this is the message that needs to be proclaimed in 21st century Christianity. The advancement of Jesus' mission is and always will be worth any discomfort we might experience. Let me say that again. The advancement of Jesus' mission is and will always be worth any discomfort we might experience. See, because if we forget that message, well, you and I will bail at the first threat of discomfort. But if we understand suffering is momentary and light compared to the eternal rewards, then we won't knuckle under when things get hard. So then they return to this original Antioch. In verses 24 through 28, I'll just read it quickly. They passed through Pisidia, came to Pamphylia. They had spoken the word at Perga, and they went down to Attalia. And from there they sailed to Antioch, from which they had been commended to the grace of God for the work they had accomplished. Verse 27, and when they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all these things that God had done with them, and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles, and how they spent a long time with these disciples. I'm going to show you the map again. So remember, they left this Antioch. They go all the way over to Lystra and Derbe. You just follow the lines. And now they're retracing their steps. And as they retrace their steps, they leave Derbe and Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, come down to Perga. Everywhere they go, they're strengthening believers to say what you suffer is going to be worth it. And then they sail all the way back to Antioch, where they started. Pretty important. Paul and Barnabas came all the way back to their home church, their original sending site. Why? Well, they needed to refuel, probably, get healthy, be strengthened emotionally, spiritually, physically, because Paul would need to go out again. Paul knew he would go out again. See, Jesus was not a part-time hobby for Paul. His course was set. No amount of suffering was going to stop him from Jesus' mission to save. You remember we said last week, John 10:10 really has the mission of Jesus, but it also has the mission of the evil one. John 10:10 says the mission of the evil one is steal, kill, and destroy. The mission of the evil one is death. And it says that Jesus came that we might have life. See, Jesus' mission is to save. And Paul wanted to make sure he's on the save side of that equation. For a disciple, that cause is without compare. Nothing even begins to compare with building Jesus' eternal kingdom. And we better make sure that we aren't straddling the fence, that we're on the save side of the equation. Too many believers today are going, well, that's nice for them, but I'm going to play it safe. As a believer in Jesus Christ, you better be on the save side of the equation. Let me be clear. As a disciple of Christ, it's foolish to ask God for suffering. It's foolish just to go ahead. I'm just going to self-induce some suffering. Suffering will find us because the bear is untrained. And when suffering finds us, we shouldn't be surprised. It's like what Peter said, don't be surprised by the fiery ordeal among you, as though some strange thing were happening to us. Next time you suffer, don't be surprised by your suffering as though some strange thing were happening to you. Because as we follow Jesus and we attempt to represent what Jesus is like to a watching world, I want to paint a picture to you. I believe that in life, God calls you as a believer to the role of a lighthouse. But at the same time, God calls us to the role of a lightning rod. And I want you to be very clear in understanding this. I want to be very clear in explaining this. As a lighthouse, your task is to guide people in the midst of the storm to safety. In our case, to eternal safety. And God has also called us to be a lightning rod, because our job is to believe, as a believer in Jesus Christ, is to protect other people so that they can not be damaged in the storm and they can hear the claims of Christ. God calls you to be a lighthouse, but he also calls you to be a lightning rod. And let me remind you, both of those roles are created for the storm. A lighthouse is not created for ease and comfort. A lightning rod is not created for ease and comfort. As a lighthouse and as a lightning rod, you were made for the storm. And the influence is worth the pain. The influence is worth the pain. See, I want to be very careful. Because some of you are going through some difficult stuff. Right now, I can't imagine. You know, when I think of Daniel and Jenna and Aspen, and I couldn't help it, as I'm writing this, I'm thinking of them. Daniel's got a death sentence hanging over his head. And this sounds very flippant to say to them, you know what, your suffering is momentary and light. But you know what, that's not flippant, that's hopeful. Because if I've got cancer, I want to know that God is not wasting my pain. And in the midst of physical affliction, God is saying, hey, I want you to know this. It's momentary and light comparatively, and it'll be worth it in eternity. And if you're going through emotional struggle and God is saying to you, I want you to know it's momentary and light comparatively, and it's going to be worth it. And if you're going through spiritual harassment on my behalf, God is saying it's momentary and it's light comparatively. See, that's not flippant. That's not blowing off somebody's pain. I can still pray every day that Daniel would survive this and he would dance on my grave. But if God so chooses not to, then I want him to know that God isn't wasting his pain. See, and in this, people with a death sentence hanging over, because in reality, every single one of us has a death sentence hanging on our head. Do you understand that? Some people have just been told when their death sentence is, but all of us have a death sentence hanging over our head. You know, I want to close with this thought. I want us to begin with the end in mind. I think this is one of those great learning principles. Begin with the end in mind. So I want you to begin with me when you are in heaven. That ending picture, I want you to begin with that. And I'm sure as we are in heaven, I know that there will be an interaction that we have with Jesus. And I know it'll be for all eternity. And in the midst of that interaction with Jesus, I picture that at one point in time, Jesus will ask us, was your allegiance to me worth it? And I believe without hesitation, we will glimpse at our scars, whether emotional or physical, but more importantly, we will glimpse at his scars. And we will say emphatically, I would gladly suffer for you, Jesus, all over again. I believe that with all my heart. Because all of us in eternity will know, oh my gosh, he has made it worth it. And don't be surprised after that interchange, you hear a line from your Savior, maybe as Jesus is walking away. And he says, well done, good and faithful servant. See, I'd like to ask you to do something that we wouldn't normally do. Would you bow your heads? And I want you to thank him. First of all, I want you to thank God for your suffering. What? Yes. Because he is orchestrating a perfection in you that cannot be measured. And I would like you to thank him in advance that he makes your suffering worth it.